Subscribe for more thrilling stories. The night was heavy with tension, the city streets glistening from the recent rain as if the heavens themselves were crying. Inside the opulent penthouse atop the tallest building in the city, the air was thick with danger and unspoken fear. Isabella had been working for the Mancini family for barely 6 months, and yet, every day felt like walking on a tightrope above a canyon. She was young, innocent in ways that made her both vulnerable and inexplicably captivating. And the man who ruled this dangerous empire, the man she called simply boss, was someone she had been forced to fear, respect, and, unknowingly, care for. Anthony Mancini was a legend in the underworld, a man who could command armies with a glance and strike fear into hearts with a whisper. Yet tonight, the ruthless mob boss was not focused on territory disputes, or rival families, or even the fortune that lay behind the steel doors of his office. No, tonight, his gaze was fixed entirely on Isabella, lying unconscious in the corner of his lavish office, a faint line of blood at the corner of her lips. "Stay with me, Isabella," he whispered, his voice breaking for the first time in years. His hand trembled slightly as he brushed a stray strand of hair from her pale face. The war that had been raging between him and the rival Romano family could have claimed thousands of lives tonight, yet Anthony had called an abrupt ceasefire, halting gunmen mid-assault, pausing bombs set to detonate, all because of the fragile heartbeat of the woman who barely knew the depths of his power. Earlier that evening, it had all started so normally. Isabella had been delivering documents to Anthony's office when a sudden ambush occurred. Gunshots had ripped through the night like furious thunderclaps, and Isabella, caught in the crossfire, had been struck and thrown against the marble floor. Panic had swept through Anthony's men, but he moved with terrifying precision. One moment he had been in a heated negotiation over territory, the next he was tearing through his own security to reach her side. He knelt beside her now, his dark eyes scanning every inch of her small frame, memorizing the rise and fall of her chest, willing her to awaken. "You can't leave me, not like this," he murmured, his hand pressing gently against her forehead, feeling the warmth that told him she was still alive. But barely. Isabella's life had always been simple. She had worked hard, saved carefully, and never imagined that she would become entangled in a world where a single wrong step could mean death. And yet, despite the danger, she had never felt so alive as when Anthony's presence loomed near, a paradox of terror and safety. His power was intoxicating, his gaze magnetic, yet it was the vulnerability in his words tonight that struck her even in unconsciousness. Anthony had ordered the room cleared, everyone except his closest bodyguards had been sent away. He didn't want anyone else's fear clouding the room, this was his battle to fight alone. He gently lifted Isabella into his arms, cradling her like she was made of porcelain, delicate and fragile, yet impossible to ignore. Every step he took toward the hidden medical room in the penthouse was deliberate, calculated, because he knew that the slightest mistake could end her life before it had even fully begun. As he laid her on the examination table, he whispered once more, "Hold on for me, just hold on." He clenched his fists, his knuckles white against the black leather gloves, as memories of past losses, the lives he couldn't save, the people who had slipped through his fingers, haunted him. He was a man who had conquered empires, negotiated peace between rival families, and survived betrayals that would have killed others. And yet now, he was powerless, staring at a single heartbeat that could slip away in moments. The city outside continued its restless hum, unaware of the drama unfolding above. But Anthony's world had narrowed to this one room, this one girl, this one fragile life that mattered more than anything else. He had fought wars, made decisions that ended thousands of lives, yet nothing had ever scared him like this. He had realized something in these few terrifying minutes. Power, money, control, it meant nothing without someone to care about. And Isabella, she had become that someone, whether he admitted it to himself or not. Minutes stretched into hours as Anthony remained by her side, refusing to leave, refusing to eat, refusing even to drink. His men had whispered that he should rest, that the girl was safe, but Anthony's mind was too focused, too desperate to allow anyone else to intervene. Every movement of her chest, every tiny flutter of her eyelids was a victory and a torment at once. Finally, as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the room in a soft golden glow, Isabella's fingers twitched. Anthony leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat. "Isabella," he asked softly, almost afraid to speak. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding her gaze before recognition and relief swept across her face. You're awake, he said, his voice hoarse, laden with emotion. I thought I'd lost you. Isabella's lips curved into a weak, trembling smile. You saved me, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Anthony's gaze hardened, a flicker of that ruthless mafia fire returning. I'd end a war, burn the city to the ground, do whatever it takes to keep you alive, he said, his voice low, dangerous, and filled with a promise. Don't ever forget that. And in that moment, surrounded by opulence, danger, and the remnants of a night that could have been her last, something unspoken passed between them, a bond forged not by love alone, but by survival, desperation, and the undeniable pull of fate. The war outside could wait. For Anthony Mancini, the world had narrowed to a single heartbeat. And for Isabella, the life she thought she knew had changed forever. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the penthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floors, yet the room still felt heavy with the weight of the night's events. Isabella sat up slowly, her body aching, and a soft gasp escaped her lips as she realized just how close she had come to death. Anthony was still kneeling beside her, his dark eyes unwavering, filled with a mixture of relief and barely contained fury. Don't move too fast, he warned, his voice a low growl, almost protective in tone. You need rest. But rest, she realized, was impossible when every glance he gave her felt like a lifeline she had only just clung to. She tried to find words, but the terror and confusion of the past hours left her speechless. Anthony didn't press. He merely studied her, memorizing every detail, the pale curve of her cheek, the faint tremor in her fingers, the way her eyes darted around, searching for danger. He had risked everything to bring her back, and now, seeing her awake, he felt a surge of emotions he had long buried under layers of calculated control and cold logic. There was relief, yes, but also something more, a fierce protectiveness, a desire that startled him as much as it would have anyone else to see. You saved me, Isabella finally whispered, her voice trembling as she struggled to sit fully upright. I don't even know how to thank you. Anthony's hand reached out, steady and deliberate, and he helped her adjust on the bed, his touch careful, almost reverent. No thanks, he said simply. I couldn't let anything happen to you. Not tonight, not ever. The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. Isabella's heart pounded, and she realized that she was standing on the edge of a world she didn't fully understand, a world of power, danger, and men who ruled with fear. Yet, in Anthony's presence, that fear had transformed into something else entirely, an electrifying tension, a connection that neither of them could deny. She felt it in the way his eyes never left her, in the subtle shift of his body as he moved to protect her from even the smallest discomfort. Anthony stood then, pacing the room like a predator contained by invisible walls. His mind raced, not with strategies for his criminal empire, but with plans to ensure Isabella's safety. He could hear the distant rumble of the city awakening, the world oblivious to the quiet drama unfolding high above in his fortress of power. He had made decisions in his life that cost countless lives, but tonight, he realized that one person, one fragile heartbeat, mattered more than any deal, any victory, any empire he had built. And for the first time in years, Anthony felt a vulnerability he had long avoided. Isabella watched him with a mixture of awe and fear. She had seen glimpses of his ruthlessness before, had heard stories whispered among the staff about the man who could command fear with a glance. But this side of him, the side that risked everything for her, that hovered near her bed like a silent guardian, was something entirely new. It confused her, thrilled her, and terrified her all at once. She wanted to speak, to reach out, but the words caught in her throat, leaving only a heavy silence between them. Finally, Anthony turned to her, his expression softening, though his eyes remained sharp. Listen to me carefully, he said, his tone now a mixture of command and plea. You cannot leave this penthouse alone for the next few days. Not until I'm sure you're completely safe. No errands, no walks, no unnecessary risks. Do you understand? Isabella nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over her like a cloak. She had always valued her independence, but in that moment, the gravity of his concern, and the power behind it, left her compliant. Over the next few hours, Anthony's men discreetly increased security around the penthouse. Isabella noticed the subtle changes, the new guards posted at unseen corners, the vehicles that seemed to follow but never obstructed, the way Anthony never left her side for more than a moment. It was overwhelming, almost suffocating, yet there was a strange comfort in knowing that she was being watched over so fiercely. The city outside could be dangerous, but inside these walls, Anthony's presence and protection created a bubble where she felt, for the first time, almost untouchable. Yet danger was never far away in Anthony Mancini's world. By noon, word came that the Romano family, longtime rivals, had reacted violently to the halt in the war. Explosions in the industrial district, shootouts in back alleys, Anthony's control was being challenged in real time. But even as his empire shook and his men scrambled to contain the chaos, Anthony's eyes remained on Isabella. Every decision, every call, every order he made was tempered by the knowledge that she was at the center of his world. If anything happened to her, nothing else mattered. Isabella watched him command with lethal efficiency, his mind splitting between strategy, protection, and his own internal chaos. She realized something that terrified and exhilarated her. Anthony's power was absolute, but so was his devotion to her. He was a man who could destroy kingdoms with a gesture, yet here he was, almost trembling with care for one fragile woman. The paradox of his strength and vulnerability made her heart race in ways she had never anticipated. As night fell again, Anthony returned to her side, exhaustion evident in the sharp lines of his face, yet his gaze never faltered. "You need to rest," he said, though the statement was more of a command than advice. Isabella, exhausted from the adrenaline, barely resisted. Lying there, under his watchful eyes, she understood that her life had changed forever. The world outside was dangerous, yes, but inside the walls of the penthouse, Anthony Mancini had made a silent vow: she would survive, and he would ensure it, no matter the cost. And somewhere deep inside, Isabella realized that she would follow him anywhere, into fire, into danger, into the heart of a war she could never fully comprehend. Because for the first time, she was part of something bigger than herself, a life intertwined with a man who was ruthless, magnetic, and fiercely protective. A man who had ended a war, halted a city's bloodshed, and risked everything for her. The city had never felt more dangerous to Isabella than it did in the days following her near death. From the penthouse, she watched the skyline with wide eyes, a mixture of awe and fear swirling inside her. She had always known Anthony Mancini was powerful, but the reality of his influence, the control he wielded over life and death, was far more intense than she could have imagined. Even now, sitting in the safety of his penthouse, she could feel the ripples of the chaos outside, the violent tension between rival families threatening to spill over at any moment. Yet, despite it all, she no longer felt helpless. She had Anthony by her side, a man who had risked an entire war just to ensure she survived. Anthony, for his part, had not left her side for long. Every decision he made, every phone call, every directive to his men was tempered by the knowledge that Isabella's life was still fragile. He had installed new security measures, reassigned trusted bodyguards, and even temporarily suspended certain operations to focus on her protection. And yet, even with all precautions, his instincts told him the Romano family would strike again. Their fury over the halted war was growing, and Anthony knew retaliation would come swiftly. But he could face any enemy, any threat, as long as Isabella remained unharmed. Days passed in a strange rhythm. Isabella tried to resume small tasks, organizing papers, helping Anthony sort through documents, even attempting to cook simple meals in the penthouse kitchen, but Anthony would not allow it. "You're not allowed to lift anything heavier than a pen," he reminded her sharply one afternoon, his hand resting on her shoulder as if to anchor her. She resisted the urge to roll her eyes, realizing that his protective insistence was born of genuine fear, not arrogance. Each time she disobeyed, he would glance at her with that piercing gaze that both terrified and captivated her, and she would immediately retreat, her stubbornness vanquished. One evening, Anthony brought her to the balcony, overlooking the city that stretched endlessly below. The sun was setting, painting the skyline in shades of gold and crimson. For a brief moment, the tension in Anthony's jaw softened, and Isabella noticed the rare vulnerability in his eyes. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like, if all of this didn't exist?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible over the distant hum of traffic. Anthony's gaze did not waver from hers. He considered her question carefully before responding. "Sometimes," he admitted, his voice low and almost wistful. "But then I remember, power isn't just about money or fear. It's about protecting what matters. And right now, you matter more than anything else." The weight of his words pressed on her heart, a mixture of warmth and tension that left her breathless. She had never expected such confession from the man who ruled with iron and fear. And yet, there it was, truth laid bare in the quiet of a city on the brink of war. She wanted to respond, to reach out and reassure him, but the words stuck in her throat, tangled in a mixture of awe, fear, and something dangerously close to attraction. That night, a call from one of Anthony's men shattered the fragile peace. A small group of Romano operatives had been spotted near the outskirts of the city, armed and ready. Anthony's jaw tightened, and without a word, he began issuing rapid commands. "Lock the penthouse," he ordered. "All entrances monitored. No one in or out without my approval." Isabella watched him move with lethal precision, the man she had begun to see as protector and enigma now a force of nature, every motion calculated, every decision ruthless yet necessary. She wanted to speak, to plead with him to take care of himself, but she knew better than to interrupt. Anthony had made it clear. His focus was on her safety above all else, and any distraction could cost them both dearly. As the night deepened, Isabella found herself huddled in the safest corner of the penthouse, her heart hammering in rhythm with the distant echoes of chaos outside. And yet, even in fear, she felt a strange sense of exhilaration. She was alive, she was safe, and she was connected to a man who would move heaven and earth to protect her. Hours passed with tense anticipation. Finally, Anthony returned from overseeing operations on the perimeter, his expression calm but eyes sharp as blades. He didn't speak at first, merely scanning the room, ensuring every detail was in place. Then, turning to Isabella, he offered a rare, small smile. "It's over for now," he said, his voice low and steady. "They won't make another move tonight." She exhaled, relief flooding through her, but her gaze lingered on him, searching for any sign of exhaustion or injury. Despite his controlled demeanor, she could sense the strain in his movements, the sleepless nights, the constant vigilance. "You need rest," she murmured, stepping closer. "Even you can't fight every battle alone." Anthony's eyes softened briefly, but the moment passed as quickly as it came. "Rest is a luxury I can't afford," he said bluntly, though there was an unspoken undertone. He would endure any hardship if it meant keeping her safe. Isabella nodded, realizing the depth of his commitment. Every threat, every gun, every challenge was secondary to her life. He had made that clear, time and time again, and she was beginning to understand just how rare and powerful such devotion could be. The following days unfolded in a tense rhythm. Isabella began to understand the layers of Anthony's world, the politics, the betrayals, the unending threats from rival families. She observed his interactions with his men, noting the mix of fear and respect he commanded. But she also saw moments he believed no one was watching. The small gestures of care, the quiet attention to her needs, the rare, fleeting moments of vulnerability. And with each passing day, her admiration for him grew, mingling dangerously with feelings she did not yet fully comprehend. One evening, as a storm raged outside, Anthony stood by the window, watching the rain streak the city below. Isabella approached him cautiously, drawn by an urge she couldn't explain. "Anthony," she said softly, "how do you keep going? How do you stay so strong?" He turned, his dark gaze meeting hers, sharp yet gentle. "Strength isn't just about surviving battles or wielding power," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "It's about protecting what you cannot bear to lose. And right now, that is you." Isabella felt her heart skip, a mixture of fear and longing twisting inside her. She wanted to respond, to speak the words that hovered at the edge of her lips, but she stayed silent, letting the moment linger. Anthony, sensing her hesitation, reached out, brushing a strand of damp hair from her face. "You need to understand something," he whispered, his tone almost reverent. "I will not allow anyone, or anything, to harm you. Not now, not ever. And if you ever doubt that, you will learn the consequences of crossing me." The intensity in his voice was both frightening and exhilarating, leaving Isabella breathless, caught between fear, admiration, and a growing, undeniable attraction. As the storm raged outside, the penthouse became a fortress of tension, safety, and unspoken emotions. Isabella realized that her life had irrevocably changed. She was no longer a bystander in a world of power and danger. She was central to it, entwined with a man whose loyalty was absolute and whose desire to protect her knew no bounds. And Anthony, for all his power and control, had revealed something rare and fragile within himself, a willingness to risk everything for the life of one woman. In that stormy night, surrounded by the distant echoes of a city at war, Isabella understood a truth that frightened and thrilled her in equal measure. She belonged in Anthony Mancini's world now, whether she fully understood it or not. And the man who had ended a war, halted bloodshed, and defied enemies to keep her alive, was about to pull her deeper into a life of danger, passion, and irrevocable devotion. The calm that had settled over the penthouse after the storm was deceptive, a fragile illusion that Anthony knew would shatter at any moment. Isabella, still recovering from her injuries and the terror of the past days, tried to find comfort in the safety of the high walls and relentless security surrounding her. But she could feel the tension in Anthony like a live wire. It radiated from him, taut and unyielding, a reminder that the war outside had not truly ended, and that danger was never far from their doorstep. She watched him as he moved through the penthouse with precise efficiency, his mind clearly working on multiple layers of strategy, his dark eyes flicking to monitors, phones, and the movements of his men. Anthony Mancini was a man who commanded fear, yet tonight, fear itself seemed to bend around him. Every decision he made had consequences far beyond the confines of the penthouse. The Romano family was relentless, their thirst for revenge unquenchable. Anthony knew that sooner or later, they would strike again. But for now, he was focused entirely on Isabella, her presence a tether to humanity he rarely allowed himself to feel. He had protected her, nursed her back from the edge of death, and now he was consumed by a single thought, keeping her alive at all costs. Isabella, for her part, had begun to understand the dangerous duality of Anthony. He was ruthless, a man capable of destroying anyone who opposed him without hesitation. Yet he was also fiercely protective, willing to set aside his empire, his pride, and even his life for her. The contradictions fascinated her and unsettled her at the same time. She was drawn to him, despite the fear, despite the danger, and despite the knowledge that her life had been irrevocably changed by his world, a world she had never asked to enter, but now could not imagine leaving. That night, Anthony had ordered a private dinner in the penthouse. The city outside was silent, almost as if holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash between the two powerful families. Isabella sat at the long, polished table, her fingers tracing the edges nervously. Anthony stood nearby, reviewing communications, his back straight, shoulders tense. The sight of him so focused, so determined, stirred something deep within her. She wanted to reach out, to touch him, to feel the warmth and reassurance that had become her lifeline. But fear held her back, the fear of his power, the fear of the world he controlled, and the fear of her own growing feelings. "Eat," he commanded finally, his voice calm but firm. "You need strength." His dark eyes met hers, sharp and unyielding, yet there was a hint of concern, a flicker of vulnerability that few ever saw. Isabella nodded, trying to obey, but the food seemed tasteless, swallowed with trembling hands. She had survived gunfire, near death, and chaos, but being this close to Anthony, feeling the intensity of his presence, was something entirely new and overwhelming. After dinner, Anthony guided her to the balcony, where the city lights twinkled like 1,000 tiny stars, oblivious to the danger lurking in their midst. The wind tugged at Isabella's hair, and for the first time since the attack, she allowed herself to breathe freely. Anthony stood close, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, yet not so close as to bridge the distance completely. "You can't imagine the chaos I've had to manage today," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the horizon, alert to every movement, every shadow. "But you've given me a reason to pause. A reason to care." Isabella's breath caught. The words were dangerous, tender, and utterly sincere. She had never expected such honesty from a man like him, a man whose world was built on fear, manipulation, and control. "Anthony," she began, but he placed a finger gently against her lips, silencing her. "No words," he whispered. "Not yet. Just stay here, and let me handle what comes next." The night deepened, bringing with it the faint hum of the city below. Anthony's hand brushed against hers, accidental or not she couldn't tell, but the shock of the contact sent warmth racing through her veins. He did not pull away, his gaze locking on hers, and for a moment, the dangerous, ruthless Mafia boss seemed almost human, a man capable of tenderness, capable of fear, and capable of feeling in ways that he rarely allowed. Isabella wanted to speak, to ask him to stay, to tell him that she was willing to risk everything just to remain by his side. But the words never came. Instead, she watched him silently, heart pounding, as he surveyed the city that was both his empire and his battlefield. Suddenly, the quiet was shattered by an urgent message on Anthony's encrypted phone. His expression hardened instantly, the calm mask slipping to reveal the predator beneath. Isabella could see the shift, the calculation in his eyes, the immediate tension in his jaw. "They're moving again," he muttered, almost to himself, though the edge in his voice made her shiver. "Romano's men. They've discovered a weak point. If I don't act now." His voice trailed off, but the implication was clear: failure was not an option. Anthony moved with the lethal precision of a man who had spent decades navigating danger. Every guard, every measure, every plan was enacted with ruthless efficiency. Yet through it all, his thoughts never left Isabella. He had promised to protect her, and he would honor that promise at any cost. The city could erupt into fire and blood, rival families could wage war, but she would remain untouched, safe under his watchful eyes. Hours passed in tense anticipation. By dawn, Anthony returned to the penthouse, weary but victorious. The threat had been neutralized, the Romano family's attempt thwarted, at least for now. Isabella, who had been waiting anxiously, rushed to him. "Anthony, are you okay?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. He gave her a brief, rare smile, exhaustion evident in the lines of his face. "I'm fine," he said, though she knew the truth. "Now, you rest. I'll handle everything else." As she watched him move across the room, Isabella realized the depth of her feelings: fear, awe, admiration, and something far more dangerous, attraction. She was drawn to him, to his power, to his protectiveness, and to the rare glimpses of vulnerability he allowed her to see. And Anthony, for all his strength and control, had revealed something fragile yet fierce, a devotion that could not be broken, a willingness to risk everything for one life he had chosen to protect. That night, as the city slept under a blanket of silence, Anthony stood by the window, watching, always vigilant. Isabella lay in the bed he had prepared for her, feeling both safe and profoundly aware of the storm that surrounded them. Her life had changed forever. She was no longer just a bystander in a dangerous world, she was at the center of it, and Anthony Mancini's world revolved around her. Safety, her presence, her life. And for the first time, Isabella understood the true meaning of power, not in money, not in fear, not in empires, but in the lengths one man would go to protect the one person who mattered above all else. She closed her eyes, feeling both terror and exhilaration, knowing that the days ahead would bring new threats, new challenges, and a bond with Anthony that was as dangerous as it was undeniable. The morning sun barely penetrated the thick curtains of the penthouse when Isabella awoke, her body still heavy from the lingering pain of her injuries but her mind restless. The events of the past week, the gunfire, the near death, the chaos of rival Mafia factions, had left her exhausted yet strangely alert. Anthony had remained by her side through every moment of the night, a silent sentinel, his dark eyes scanning every corner of the penthouse, every movement outside, never allowing her even a single moment of unguarded vulnerability. Isabella had begun to understand the depth of his obsession with control, not just over the city, but over her safety, over her life. And while part of her found it terrifying, another part could not deny the thrill that coursed through her veins when he was near. Anthony had been up before dawn, as usual, coordinating his men, reviewing intelligence reports, and planning preemptive strikes to ensure the Romano family did not find another opportunity to strike. His empire was vast, ruthless, and efficient, yet for the first time, Isabella realized that all of this, the power, the money, the control, was secondary to the fragile heartbeat of one woman. She watched him, unseen, as he barked orders into his phone, his voice steady but low, controlled, commanding absolute obedience. And then, in a rare moment, he paused, and his eyes softened, not for a soldier, not for a deal, but for her. "You can't keep watching like that," he said suddenly, appearing beside her before she even had a chance to react. The sudden proximity made her heart jump, her pulse racing as his hand hovered near hers, almost brushing her wrist. "It's dangerous," he added, his tone both warning and protective. Isabella swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. I just want to understand," she admitted softly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Anthony's gaze softened slightly, and he gestured toward the balcony. "Come with me. You need fresh air, not fear." Outside, the city sprawled endlessly beneath them, a maze of streets, buildings, and flickering lights. For a moment, the tension of the past week seemed to lift as they stood side by side, the night air cool against their skin. Anthony's presence was commanding, yet comforting, a paradox that Isabella could not ignore. He spoke little, but every word was deliberate, every glance calculated to convey reassurance without compromising his authority. She realized then that Anthony's strength was not just in power or control, it was in the ability to protect, to anticipate, to act before danger could reach her. The peace, however, was short-lived. A sudden alert from one of Anthony's men shattered the fragile calm, and in an instant, the penthouse erupted into controlled chaos. Another faction of the Romano family had made a bold move, attempting to infiltrate a key Mancini operation on the outskirts of the city. Anthony's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening as he took in the report. "They're getting desperate," he muttered, his voice low and dangerous. Without hesitation, he began issuing orders, his mind working at lightning speed to neutralize the threat before it escalated into open war. Isabella, standing close behind him, felt a mixture of fear and fascination. She had seen Anthony command armies before, seen him negotiate life and death situations with ruthless efficiency, but now she realized that every decision he made was colored by her presence, her safety, her survival. He had paused previous conflicts, halted a war, risked his empire, all for her. And now, even in the face of another attack, his focus remained unwavering. He would protect her, no matter the cost. As the hours dragged on, Anthony returned, exhausted but victorious. The Romano faction had been neutralized, but the tension in the air remained palpable. Isabella approached him, her voice hesitant but filled with concern. "You're pushing yourself too hard," she said softly, placing a hand on his arm. He looked down at her, his dark eyes flashing with a mix of surprise and something deeper, almost like vulnerability. "I can handle it," he replied, his voice firm but tinged with something unspoken. "But, you need to understand that your safety is my priority above everything else. Do you understand?" Isabella nodded, the weight of his words settling over her like a protective shield. She realized that she was no longer merely a bystander in this dangerous world, she was central to it, and Anthony's devotion was both a blessing and a burden. Every threat, every attack, every risk was magnified because of her, and she could not ignore the growing realization that she was becoming something more than just a survivor. She was part of the force that kept Anthony grounded, part of the reason he had paused a war, part of the reason he continued to fight despite the constant dangers surrounding him. Days passed in a tense rhythm, the city outside simmering with latent threats, while inside the penthouse, Anthony and Isabella navigated a delicate dance of proximity and caution. He allowed her moments of independence, small acts of agency, but never beyond the limits he deemed safe. She understood the logic, the calculation behind every rule, yet the closeness, the subtle touches, the intensity of his gaze left her heart racing and her thoughts conflicted. She had survived near death, and now she found herself living on the edge in a different way, entangled in the magnetic pull of a man who could destroy empires but chose to protect her instead. One evening, as a storm rolled in over the city, Isabella found herself alone in the library, perusing a collection of books she had barely touched since her arrival. Anthony appeared silently behind her, a presence so commanding that she felt a shiver run down her spine. "Storm's coming," he said quietly, his voice low and controlled, yet carrying a warmth that was rare and unguarded. "You need to stay inside." She nodded, but before she could respond further, he moved closer, standing barely an arm's length away. The intensity in his gaze made her pulse quicken. "Isabella, you have no idea how dangerous this world is. And yet, I cannot keep you away from it entirely. You belong here now, whether you realize it or not." Her breath caught, and she felt an overwhelming mix of fear, longing, and a dangerous attraction she could no longer ignore. "Anthony, she began, but he placed a finger gently on her lips, silencing her. "Not now," he whispered. "Tonight is about survival, not confession." The heat of his hand, the nearness of his body, the gravity of his words left her trembling. She realized that she was no longer just a part of his world by circumstance, she was part of it by his choice, and that choice carried power, responsibility, and a deep, unspoken bond. Hours later, as the storm raged outside, Isabella lay in the bed Anthony had prepared for her, listening to the rhythmic tapping of rain against the windows. She thought about the past week, the attacks, the near death, the moments of tenderness he had allowed her. Her heart ached with a mixture of fear and longing, and she realized that her life had been forever altered. She was no longer a bystander, no longer just a victim. She was part of a dangerous, intoxicating world where one man's obsession could protect her from everything but also bind her in ways she did not fully understand. And Anthony, standing watch over her from the shadows of the penthouse, understood it too. He had fought wars, commanded fear, and built an empire, but none of it mattered more than the life of the woman who had survived his protection, who had become his reason to pause, to care, to fight with a ferocity even his enemies could not comprehend. She was at the center of his world now, and he would ensure she remained untouched by the chaos that swirled beyond the penthouse walls. The city had fallen into an uneasy silence, the kind that always preceded chaos in Anthony Mancini's world. Isabella, still recovering from her injuries, could feel the tension even from within the safety of the penthouse. Every sound, the faint hum of a car engine outside, the distant siren wailing in the streets, the subtle footsteps of a guard in the hallway, kept her alert. She had never known a world so alive with danger, yet, paradoxically, she had never felt so alive herself. The near-death experience, the relentless protection, and the proximity of Anthony had changed her, reshaped her perceptions of fear, trust, and desire. Every glance he gave her, every careful gesture, made her heart race in ways she could not ignore. Anthony, as always, was up before dawn, a shadow moving through his empire with lethal precision. He monitored communications, scanned the city, and reviewed reports from his men with a meticulous attention that left no room for error. Yet, in the midst of all the calculations, the strategies, and the cold pragmatism, his thoughts always returned to Isabella. She had survived because of him, yes, but more importantly, she had become the one reason he questioned everything else. She was no longer just a person under his protection, she was a force that gave meaning to the calculated, ruthless life he led. By late morning, Anthony had summoned his closest lieutenants. The Romano family, furious at their repeated failures, had escalated their attempts to infiltrate his territory. Rumors of a larger attack, one that could spill blood in the streets, reached him through coded messages and intercepted calls. Anthony's jaw hardened, his dark eyes narrowing as he analyzed every detail. "We need to strike before they can plan anything more," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Every operation, every asset, every man at your disposal. I don't want a single detail missed." His lieutenants nodded, but he could see the underlying worry in their eyes. They knew the cost of failure, and now, they knew it could endanger Isabella as well. Meanwhile, Isabella observed him silently, her pulse quickening at the sight of him commanding fear and respect with a glance. She had begun to see the duality of Anthony, the ruthless, feared mafia boss and the man who would move heaven and earth for her. She understood, perhaps for the first time, the gravity of her place in his life. He had ended a war, halted attacks, and risked countless lives to keep her safe. And now, faced with the looming threat of the Romano family's retaliation, she realized she was at the center of another storm, one that would test their connection, their trust, and the depths of his devotion. By evening, Anthony returned to the penthouse after personally overseeing the operations to secure his territory. Isabella watched him as he entered, exhaustion etched into the lines of his face, but his gaze remained as sharp and commanding as ever. "Everything is contained for now," he said, his voice steady despite the fatigue. "But we cannot let our guard down. They will try again, and next time, it could be worse." Isabella moved closer to him, a mix of concern and something more, an unspoken attraction that she could no longer deny. "You can't keep doing this alone," she said softly, her hand brushing against his arm. He looked at her, the weight of the world and his emotions reflected in his dark eyes. "I know," he admitted. "But right now, my focus is on you. Nothing else matters as long as you are safe." The storm outside mirrored the tension inside the penthouse. Rain pounded against the windows as Anthony guided Isabella to the balcony, a gesture meant to distract, to calm, and perhaps to bridge the gap between fear and longing. The city below seemed oblivious to the danger looming over it, unaware that rival factions were plotting, attacking, and waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Anthony's presence beside her was commanding, protective, and undeniably magnetic. Isabella felt the pull of his energy, the undeniable intensity of a man whose life was defined by control, yet who allowed himself to care so deeply for one fragile human being. "I can't keep you confined forever," Anthony said quietly, his gaze scanning the horizon. "But I also cannot allow a single risk to reach you." His words struck her deeply. he was aware of the paradox, aware that the desire to protect could clash with her need for autonomy. Yet in that moment, Isabella understood the depth of his obsession, the lengths he would go to safeguard her. She wanted to reach out, to tell him she understood, that she would trust him, but her voice caught in her throat. Instead, she simply allowed him to remain close, feeling the heat radiating from him, the energy that was equal parts danger and safety. Hours passed, and the penthouse settled into a tense quiet. Anthony, ever vigilant, monitored the situation from a private office, his mind calculating every possible move, anticipating every potential threat. Isabella, unable to sleep, watched him from the doorway. She could see the exhaustion in his posture, the slight tremor in his hands as he reviewed reports, the intensity in his eyes that never wavered from the protection of his empire, and her. For all his power, his control, and his fearsome reputation, he was bound to her in ways that were rare, intimate, and dangerous. She realized then that she had become more than a person he protected. She had become a reason, a motive, and perhaps the only thing that could pierce the layers of steel he had built around himself. Suddenly, a coded alert lit up the screen in Anthony's office. Isabella's pulse quickened as she watched him react instantly, his body coiled like a panther ready to strike. "They've found a weakness," he muttered under his breath. "Romano is playing a dangerous game, and it could cost everything." He moved with lethal precision, calling his men, deploying countermeasures, and ensuring that every entry point, every access, every vulnerability was secured. Isabella realized that this was the reality of being connected to him. Danger was never far, and her safety depended entirely on his vigilance, his strategy, and his obsession. By dawn, the immediate threat had been neutralized, but the tension remained. Isabella approached him quietly, her eyes searching for the man behind the mask of power. "Anthony, you can't keep carrying all of this alone," she whispered. He turned to her, the weariness in his gaze tempered by the intensity of his resolve. "I don't carry it alone," he said softly. "You are part of this now. Your life, your presence, it gives me a reason to fight harder, to think sharper, to protect with everything I have." The words left her breathless, her heart racing, and for the first time, she realized that she had fallen irrevocably into his world, where danger, desire, and devotion were inseparable. As Isabella lay in bed that morning, listening to the faint hum of the city waking outside, she reflected on the past days, the attacks, the near death, the unrelenting tension, and understood one undeniable truth: she belonged to Anthony Mancini's world now, a world of power, danger, and unyielding loyalty. And Anthony, standing watch over her from the shadows of the penthouse, knew that he would risk everything, defy every enemy, and conquer every challenge to ensure her survival. Their lives were now irrevocably intertwined, bound by danger, desire, and the unspoken promise that neither would ever let the other fall. The penthouse was unusually quiet that night, but Anthony knew better than to trust the silence. Danger lurked in every corner of the city, in every whispered conversation and coded message intercepted by his men. Isabella, still recovering but more alert than ever, felt the tension radiating from him. She had come to understand that Anthony Mancini's life was a constant balance between power, fear, and unyielding control, and that her safety was the axis around which everything else revolved. She watched him as he moved across the room, his sharp eyes scanning reports, phone alerts, and surveillance feeds, his every motion precise and deliberate. There was no room for error in his world, and yet tonight, there was an unease in him she had never seen before, a flicker of concern that set her heart racing. Anthony had learned through his extensive intelligence network that the Romano family was planning something unprecedented. It was not a simple attack or territorial incursion, this time, it was personal. They had discovered Isabella's connection to him, her presence in the penthouse, and they were intent on using her as leverage to dismantle his empire. Anthony's jaw tightened, his dark eyes flashing with anger and determination. Every move he had made in the past weeks, the protection, the strategies, the warnings, had led to this moment. Now, the safety of the woman he had risked everything to save was being directly threatened, and he knew the stakes had never been higher. Isabella, sensing the shift in his demeanor, approached him cautiously. "Anthony, what's happening?" she asked softly, her voice laced with concern. He turned to her, the weight of his world evident in the hard lines of his face, yet his gaze softened as it always did when he looked at her. "They know about you," he said quietly, almost as if speaking aloud could make the reality worse. "Romano knows you exist, and he intends to use you against me." That's why you've been so important these past days, not just for your safety, but because your life has become a bargaining chip. Isabella's breath caught. Fear surged through her, sharp and undeniable, but so did a strange sense of resolve. She realized that she could no longer be a passive participant in the dangerous world Anthony inhabited. Her life had been intertwined with his from the moment he had risked war to save her, and now, knowing that she was the target, she understood that she had to trust him completely, and perhaps, in some ways, fight alongside him. Anthony's phone buzzed, snapping him back into action. He moved swiftly, calling in his closest operatives, issuing orders that were precise, calculated, and ruthless. Isabella watched him, awe and fear mingling in her chest. He was a man capable of commanding armies, navigating treacherous alliances, and extinguishing threats with efficiency that bordered on terrifying. Yet despite the power, despite the danger, every decision he made seemed anchored to one unshakable priority: her safety. The Romano family might have believed they could manipulate him, exploit him, or intimidate him, but they had severely underestimated the lengths he would go to protect Isabella. As the night deepened, Anthony and Isabella moved to the balcony to survey the city below. Rain streaked the windows, casting distorted reflections of the skyline, but Anthony's eyes were focused, sharp, unyielding. "We cannot let them corner us," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "If they think they can use you, if they think they can manipulate me through you, they are gravely mistaken." Isabella placed a tentative hand on his arm, feeling the tension ripple through his body. "Anthony, I trust you," she whispered. "I know you'll protect me." His gaze softened for a brief moment, the rare vulnerability that only she seemed able to draw from him. "You must," he said firmly, though there was an underlying note of something deeper: desire, concern, and an unspoken promise that she was now irrevocably central to his world. Hours later, the first signs of the Romano family's movement became clear. Anthony's men intercepted communications suggesting a covert infiltration attempt at one of his outer facilities. He moved with the precision of a man who had anticipated every possibility, every outcome, every potential threat. Isabella, though terrified, observed him closely. She saw the way his mind raced, the way he calculated risk and deployed resources, the subtle ways he balanced aggression with caution. Every action was designed to protect her, every plan executed with her survival at the forefront of his priorities. By midnight, the infiltration had been thwarted, but Anthony knew this was only the beginning. The Romano family was escalating, growing desperate, and increasingly dangerous. Isabella, standing close to him, realized the true extent of the danger she had stepped into by being connected to him. She was no longer merely a bystander; her presence had become both a shield and a vulnerability, something the enemy could exploit, and something Anthony would protect with a ferocity she had never imagined. As Anthony's men regrouped, Isabella found herself drawn to him in ways that were impossible to ignore. "Anthony, you've risked everything for me," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know how to repay you, or even if I should try." He turned to her, his gaze piercing yet soft, and for a moment, the world outside, the threat, the violence, the rivalries, faded into the background. "You don't need to repay me," he whispered, stepping closer. "You survive. You stay alive. That's enough. That's everything." The intensity of the moment hung between them, heavy and undeniable. Isabella felt the pull of his presence, the magnetic energy that was equal parts danger and protection. She realized that her feelings for him had grown beyond fear, beyond admiration. They had become something deeper, something she could no longer resist. And Anthony, despite his relentless control and ruthless exterior, allowed himself a rare moment of intimacy, a flicker of vulnerability that spoke volumes. He had fought wars, commanded fear, and built an empire, but Isabella had become the center of his world, the one reason he could pause, the one reason he could care. Hours later, as dawn approached, Anthony remained vigilant, monitoring the city, his empire, and the threats that loomed on every horizon. Isabella, lying in the bed prepared for her in the secure penthouse, felt the weight of their connection settle over her. She understood now that her life had irrevocably changed. She was part of his world, entwined in his empire, and central to his purpose. And Anthony, standing watch in the shadows, knew that no enemy, no threat, no force in the city could ever take her from him. She was his responsibility, his obsession, and his reason to continue, even when the world around them seemed intent on destruction. In that tense, charged silence, Isabella realized that she had become more than a survivor. She had become a part of the pulse of Anthony Mancini's world, a life he would protect at any cost, a presence he could not ignore, and a bond that neither danger nor distance could sever. And Anthony, despite the ruthless nature of his empire, had revealed a truth few ever witnessed: the power to protect, the obsession to survive, and the capacity to care for one fragile human being above all else. The city outside was cloaked in darkness, but Anthony Mancini's penthouse remained a fortress of vigilance, the quiet hum of security systems a reminder of the danger that never truly slept. Isabella had grown accustomed to the tension, the constant undercurrent of fear and adrenaline, yet tonight it felt different. The Romano family's threats had escalated to a point where Anthony had personally taken command of every operation, leaving nothing to chance. Isabella watched him as he moved through the penthouse with lethal precision, every step, every gesture, every command calculated to maintain control, to protect her, to end the looming threat once and for all. She realized now, with clarity and awe, that she was no longer merely a witness to his power. She was at the center of it, the reason behind it, the axis around which his ruthless world revolved. Anthony's dark eyes, usually so impenetrable, held a glimmer of something more tonight, an intensity that combined fury, devotion, and something dangerously personal. He had risked everything to keep her alive, to halt the chaos of a war, to stop bloodshed not for territory or money, but for her. And now, with the Romano family poised to strike again, he could feel the pressure mounting, the stakes higher than ever before. Isabella, sensing the weight on his shoulders, approached him cautiously. "Anthony, they won't succeed," she said softly, though her own fear tinged the words. He turned to her, gaze locking with hers, and for a brief, rare moment, he allowed himself to release the tension, if only slightly. "Not if I can help it," he replied, voice low, firm, and commanding, yet threaded with something intimate that made her pulse quicken. The hours passed in a blur of strategy, encrypted communications, and silent preparation. Anthony's men were deployed with precision, securing every vulnerable point, anticipating every possible move the Romano family might attempt. Isabella remained close, her presence a reminder of what was at stake, yet also a grounding force that kept him tethered to something beyond the violence and power he wielded. She watched him, noting the subtle exhaustion in his shoulders, the tension in his jaw, the rare flickers of humanity that emerged amidst the calculated ruthlessness. It was mesmerizing, intoxicating, and terrifying all at once. Then, as the city teetered on the edge of chaos, the attack came. The Romano family's forces, desperate and bold, launched a coordinated strike against one of Anthony's outer operations. Alarms blared, guards responded, and Anthony's mind shifted instantly into battle mode. Every order, every move, every strategy was executed with deadly precision. Isabella watched from the secure penthouse, heart hammering, as the world she had reluctantly become a part of unfolded before her eyes. Anthony was a force of nature, ruthless, unstoppable, yet every decision, every risk, every maneuver was guided by one unwavering priority: her safety. Hours of tense combat and calculated countermeasures passed. Anthony's men neutralized the threat, dismantling the Romano family's attempt with efficiency that left no margin for error. By the time silence returned, Anthony emerged victorious, though the exhaustion etched into his face betrayed the effort required to protect not just his empire, but the life of one woman. Isabella ran to him as soon as she could, throwing herself into his arms. "Anthony, you did it," she whispered, voice trembling with relief and awe. He held her tightly, almost as if he feared she would vanish the moment he let go. "I promised you," he murmured, his lips brushing the top of her head, "I would protect you. Always." For the first time since their lives had collided in chaos and danger, Isabella allowed herself to fully lean into him, to feel the warmth, the safety, the intensity of a man who had risked everything for her. The adrenaline of fear had faded, replaced by a profound connection, a bond forged in violence, trust, and the shared knowledge that life could be fleeting, fragile, and devastatingly precious. She realized then that her survival was intertwined with him, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, a tether that could not be severed, no matter the dangers that remained outside their walls. Anthony, feeling the weight of victory and relief, finally allowed a moment of vulnerability that no one had ever witnessed. He held her close, inhaling the faint scent of her hair, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. "You have no idea what you mean to me," he whispered, voice low, raw, and unguarded. Isabella tilted her head up, eyes locking with his, seeing not the feared mafia boss, not the ruthless empire builder, but the man beneath, the man who could be consumed by obsession, loyalty, and an unwavering desire to protect. I think I understand now, she said softly, tears brimming in her eyes. You would risk everything, for me. Anthony's hand cupped her face, thumb brushing gently across her cheek. Everything, he confirmed, his eyes dark, intense, and impossible to resist. Empires, wars, fear, it all means nothing if you're not safe. And now, you are. For tonight, at least. And I will make sure it stays that way. The words were both a vow and a promise, binding them in a way that transcended danger, fear, and even time itself. In the quiet aftermath, as dawn's first light began to pierce the skyline, Isabella and Anthony remained together on the balcony, the city below slowly waking from its slumber. The Romano family had been dealt a blow that would keep them reeling, at least temporarily, but Anthony knew this world would never truly be safe. And yet, for the first time, he allowed himself a moment to breathe, to feel, to recognize that the woman beside him had become not just a charge, but a partner, a reason, and a force that had reshaped his world entirely. Isabella leaned against him, feeling the steady strength of his body, the security of his presence, and the unspoken depth of his devotion. Anthony, she whispered, voice soft and trembling, what now? He turned to her, eyes blazing with intensity yet softened by care. Now, we live, he said simply. We survive, and we face whatever comes, together. His hand threaded through hers, a silent vow that whatever threats, dangers, or betrayals awaited, they would confront them as one. The days that followed were filled with careful vigilance, but the immediate threat had passed. Isabella began to explore the city with Anthony's approval, cautiously stepping beyond the safety of the penthouse, always under the watchful eyes of his trusted men. She saw the duality of his empire, the ruthless dealings, the calculated control, and the moments of unexpected kindness, particularly toward her. She understood now that Anthony Mancini was a man of contradictions, feared and revered, ruthless and tender, dangerous yet protective. And she was irrevocably caught in the center of it, her life entwined with his in ways she could never have imagined. One evening, as the sun set over the skyline, painting the city in gold and crimson, Anthony and Isabella stood alone on the balcony, the wind tugging gently at her hair. He turned to her, gaze intense and unyielding. I will not allow anyone to hurt you, he said firmly. Not now, not ever. And if you ever doubt me, his voice softened, becoming almost a whisper, you will feel the consequences. Isabella shivered, not from fear, but from the intensity, the passion, and the undeniable devotion in his eyes. She knew then that she had found not just protection, but a force that would defy empires, wars, and time itself for her sake. As the night settled over the city, Isabella realized a profound truth. She had survived because of Anthony, yes, but she had also chosen to belong to his world. And he, in turn, had risked everything, defied every enemy, and ended wars not for power, not for glory, but for her. Their lives, once separate, were now inseparable, bound by danger, desire, and a promise forged in fire. And as Anthony held her close, whispering words of protection and devotion, Isabella knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together, unstoppable, unbroken, and irrevocably bound.